Mark chapter 4, secrets sealed in earth and sea. The living room fan turns with a rhythmic click, slicing through the warm evening air while 6 open Bibles lie scattered across the low wooden table. Austin rubs his thumb along the edge of his page, his eyes tracking the group as they settle into the 4th chapter. We are moving away from the crowded house of chapter 3 where biological lines were completely shattered, Austin says, leaning forward on his knees. The text places us right back by the water, but the structural stakes have drastically escalated. Before we read the Sower, look at how the chapter frames the mechanics of teaching itself. Verse 9 ends with a strict command. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. This somatic formula isn't an invitation to a casual story. It is a defensive boundary line anchored directly to Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 29. The secret things belong to the Lord, but the revealed things belong to us. The parables function as an intentional safeguard against speculative human hubris. Samuel frowns, his pen hovering over his legal pad. Wait, Austin. Standard Sunday school lessons always present parables as neat little illustrations meant to make difficult concepts easy for the common crowd to grab. You're saying it's a barrier? Chloe pulls her feet up onto the sofa, her face illuminated by the amber glow of the table lamp. It reads like a sorting mechanism, Samuel. Look at verse 11. The text breaks the audience into 2 completely separate camps. To those inside, the mysterion of the kingdom is granted, but to those outside, everything comes in riddles. It's almost judicial. Ethan taps a finger against his open page, filtering the structural shift through a pragmatic lens. The lexical progression here backs Chloe up. Right after the insiders ask for the meaning in private, verse 12 drops the hammer by quoting Isaiah chapter 6 verses 9 to 10. They may be ever seeing but never perceiving, and ever hearing but never understanding. Otherwise they might turn and be forgiven. In a Western rational mindset, we treat mystery like an information gap, or a cryptographic puzzle that we can eventually parse if we just compile enough data. But if you look at how ancient Eastern theology processes this, mystery is an ontological reality. The parable is a shaded lens protecting a calloused, self-reliant observer from the blinding, explosive reality of an uncreated kingdom that would otherwise incinerate their spiritual framework. Verse 24 explicitly calculates the metric of insight. With the measure you use, it will be measured to you. The precise amount of focused sensory weight you invest determines the volume of revelation you get back. Samuel shifts uncomfortably in his chair, staring down at the commentary notes in his margin. It feels incredibly harsh to say Jesus is intentionally veiling information from the public, but the agricultural details in the second half of the discourse are even more disruptive. Look at the mustard seed in verse 31. I've always been told this is just a heartwarming picture of the church growing from a tiny seed into a magnificent, welcoming tree where birds can nest. Ethan shakes his head quickly, sliding his finger down to the Greek roots. That is exactly the sentimental lens that skips right past the first-century context, Samuel. The architecture of a massive, noble tree providing canopy shelter for the birds of heaven is a highly specific, politically charged apocalyptic blueprint from Ezekiel chapter 17 and 31. Ezekiel uses the majestic cedar of Lebanon to represent high-status, centralized global empires holding legal political dominion over client states. But Jesus doesn't say the kingdom is a cedar. He executes a profound theological parody by substituting the cedar with a mustard plant, Sinapis nigra. A mustard plant is an invasive, fast-growing garden weed. To a first-century mind focused on strict agricultural boundaries, planting mustard was highly restricted because it would aggressively overrun the terrain, consuming resources and defying human containment. And the birds of heaven aren't a cute addition. They represent the sudden, multi-ethnic, chaotic swarm of the unclean Gentile nations rushing into the expanding shade of a weed-like kingdom. Sarah leans in, her eyes wide as she bridges the data. So the kingdom isn't a pristine, state-sanctioned institution of imperial order? It acts like a dominant holy contagion overrunning the clean structures of the religious establishment, providing immediate shelter to the very outcasts deemed permanently compromised. Austin smiles, tapping his finger against the page as he prepares to transition the study. The ear that truly hears the parables understands that the invasive shade is about to overwrite the borders of the world, which brings us to late afternoon in verse 35, where the strategy shifts from a hidden discourse on the shore to a coordinated military campaign across the water. Jesus says, "Let us go over to the other side." Lucas, who has remained entirely silent for the first hour, looks up excitedly from the corner of the sofa. Hold on, before we read past the windstorm, this is the exact moment that video from BLK-SHP Bible Talk completely ruins standard lessons for me. We usually read the storm as a random bout of bad weather, where Jesus takes a power nap, but look at the cosmological map of where they are sailing. Leaving the safe, Ordered Jewish western shore of Galilee means they are executing a deliberate physical penetration into the eastern front, the region of Bashan and the Decapolis. In the ancient Near Eastern imagination, Bashan was considered the literal entrance to the underworld, the Serpent's Mountain, occupied enemy territory allotted to hostile lesser gods under Deuteronomy chapter 32. To get there, they have to cross the Tehom, the primordial aquatic abyss where chaos resides and Leviathan coils. The video pointed out that Mark is framing chapters 4 and 5 as a single campaign fought across two fronts, land and sea. Ethan leans over the table, his analytical focus locked onto Lucas. How does the language of the crossing reflect that? Lucas points directly at verse 39. Look at the specific verb when Jesus stands up in the swamped boat. He doesn't ask the weather to clear up. The text says he rebuked the wind and told the sea, "Silence, be still." That word for rebuke, epitimeo, is the exact technical linguistic indicator that Mark deploys when Jesus is driving unclean spirits out of human bodies. The sea isn't an environmental accident here. It is an active, resisting spiritual entity throwing a lethal windstorm, a Lelaps megale, to act as a demonic blockade to stop him from landing on that eastern shore. It's a total inversion of the Jonah narrative. Jonah slept below deck in exhausted disobedience, running from his assignment and bringing chaos down on his crew. Jesus sleeps peacefully in the stern on a cushion, because he is the architect of the boundaries of the deep. His presence doesn't cause the storm, it terminates it with a word. Chloe draws a sharp breath, her fingers tightening around her notebook. That explains the psychological shift at the very end of the chapter. Verse 41 says they were filled with great fear, megasphobos. They weren't relieved that the water went flat. Their terror actually amplified after the storm died. They look at each other and ask, who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? They realize they aren't just locked in a wooden boat in the dark with a radical rabbi or a gifted teacher. They are in the presence of the sovereign voice of the Job 38 whirlwind, the only authority in the cosmos that can command the abyss to be still. Sarah looks across at Samuel, her voice dropping to a whisper. It forces a massive crisis of application for us. When the chaos in our own lives gets loud, are we looking for a cozy, manageable guide to just make us feel better? Or are we actually ready to handle a king whose raw authority is so immense that his total calm is more terrifying than the storm itself? Austin sits back, completely intrigued by the depth of the cosmological data that Lucas brought into the circle. Lucas, that exegesis completely solidifies the transition into the next front. If the sea crossing was the battle against Tehom, then chapter 5 is the immediate encounter with Tohu, the untamable land chaos among the tombs. I need to pause here and watch that full BLK SHP video before our next session so we are completely calibrated for the Decapolis. Let's close our notes here, keep that question of raw authority in mind, and get ready to cross the frontier next Tuesday.